Hello all, welcome to another endgame study of the Solving Harder Studies to Improve Chess Calculation series. This endgame study was composed by the Russian chess composer Evgeny Markov. As always, if you haven't, I suggest you watch the guide so you are better prepared for the practice. If you already know, then the countdown will start 10 minutes, and after that, I will start with the guided solution. And here we are, and the only move possible is to go with the king b3 exclamation mark. Now that let's understand why. Well, white has 2 pawns and the bishop it's trying to play for a win, so as obvious it is, uh, just the bishop is not enough, so we need to keep 1 pawn and then promote it. Of course, this is the aim. Another thing from this position that we should also understand, it's that if black didn't have the remaining pawn, the c7 pawn, then two connected and passed pawns with the king, the enemy king, too far away, beats the rook. So this comes from the end games of the rook versus pawn end game. So if you haven't, I suggest you give it a look if you don't understand them very well. It's an opportunity to study a bit more. And so we have these two teams. So we want to promote the pawns. If we grab the last one, we are able to win it with other pawns, and at the same time, we can't lose both. But we can't go directly for the remaining pawn because black just ignores it, attacks our own pawn on b5. So even if we do something like check the king, then grab the pawn attacking the rook, well, the rook just takes 1 pawn and then takes the other. It's impossible. And rook versus bishop, it's a draw. Even if black loses the rook, of course, without further pawns, for white it's impossible anymore for win. Another idea possible on the beginning is to see, okay, if I advance the pawn, well, then I lose that pawn, and of course over here, even if I protect it with the bishop, black can keep it simple, doesn't care, because in the end it will be just one bishop against a king, which is not enough. So we still want to play bishop h2, but as we saw, we don't have time to reach our own pawns and protect it. That's why moving the king closer to the pawn, of course, d3 is at the moment controlled by the enemy rook. So we have c3 or b3. So now we need to figure out what is the difference between the main line, the king b3, and the one where the king goes to c3. Let's see that. This is a blunder. Why? Well, very fast we can see that now black has a very easy way to stop bishop h2. It just goes with the rook to h8. Notice that the difference is if we go with the king to b3, like in the main line, if the rook comes to h8, well, thank you very much. We get this fork, check the king, grab the rook in the next move, and what an easy win it will be. So, but we are analyzing the king going to c3. So we go directly to h8. So we are now controlling from the black perspective the entrance of the bishop to attack the last remaining black pawn, and things like going bishop d4 with the idea of going next to e5, just defend with the rook again, so controlling every time the attack of the bishop to the remaining pawn. But things may be different if we go with the bishop c5. Why? Because over here the bishop wants to sacrifice. And if we are not paying attention, let's say, for example, we are going to try the same idea and control the bishop d6, then we are going to be surprised with this maneuver. The bishop goes to b4, so now it's black to play. We still need to keep the rook protecting bishop d6. So let's say the rook comes to d1. Now the bishop finds another way to grab the pawn, and there's no way for you to keep the remaining pawn. And as we are going to see in other variants, the 2 pawns beat the rook. So let's say over here it's impossible for the rook to go with a defense from d8. So here the rook needs to find rook h2, of course. So it's the only other way to keep fighting for the draw. And of course now the bishop sacrifices itself, and it's black to play. I'm going to give you 1 minute. Find the move that keeps the black playing for the draw from here. And here we are. And the only way for black to draw this one is to go after the pawns directly. So rook b2, only move possible to keep the draw. Here we may see, for example, what happens if the bishop takes the pawn. Then, of course, black grabs one pawn. Now the king attacks the rook. Probably here you are tending to make the mistake of going back with the idea of checking the king from c1 and then grabbing the remaining pawn. But if you do that, don't forget the bishop will be able to block it and then you can't access the remaining pawn. So the good here is to stay on the fifth rank. And of course, the bishop may come to the side, so threatening to advance the pawn. And now it's a simple technique coming from the rook versus pawn games. If you haven't, you are going to remember it is very fast. We directly attack the pawn, so the pawn is forced to advance, and after that we grab it with a check. The king moves, and we can sacrifice. And this is, of course, a draw in the end. The other possible way for white to keep going on is to, of course, to play king c4. But now, don't we have a bishop hanging? Yes, so black just takes the pawn, the bishop, and of course, if now it advances the pawn, we simply check it from behind and grab that pawn. So white is now fighting for not losing. And what else over here? If we grab with d5, then we can simply grab the other one, check. Maybe the king takes the remaining pawn. But now, of course, black has an easy way. It just comes back, for example, to b1, and there's no way to avoid that the rook will grab the remaining pawn, and so we get a draw. So all of this was coming from the understanding of why king c3 is a blunder, because we are able to control the attack against the black pawn. So the correct move is to go with the king b3. So now we are again threatening to play bishop h2. Don't forget that we have this diagonal at our disposal at the moment, so rook h8 doesn't solve the problem. So of course the rook needs to come to d2. I think this is, of course, forced. So again, another minute for you, 1 minute. If you need more, pause, and then I come back to resume the continuation of this guided solution. And the only good move now is to sacrifice the pawn. Of course, brilliant one. Well, black accepts it, so now I offer you another minute. Pause the video if you need more. Find the last move before I go until the end with the solution. and maybe your end game technique is not on so fresh. If it's not, I suggest you watch what the Spanish priest Saavedra taught us about this end game, because of course we sacrificed the bishop, so the rook accepted, and now we are going to advance the pawn. The only way the rook to keep the game going on is to check us on d3. Notice that we are not going to want to go to c4, of course, because this just allows the rook to come back and then grab us when we promote on the other side with a skewer. So over here, the king goes up. We check it again with black, so our king goes again. Rook keeps checking. We grab the pawn and check again. And of course, now we go downstairs again. Again, theory from endgame versus pawn. Rook versus pawn endgame. So now the rook goes to d4, and this is the Saavedra moment. You can't promote to a queen. This would be a blunder. Why? Because then black just checks with the rook c4. Brilliant move, of course, because when the queen takes, it's a draw by stalemate. Isn't check, the king can't move. What a draw. But of course, we have another escape that Fernando Saavedra, the Spanish priest, taught us. So we promote to the rook. Of course, now going with the rook to check just offers the rook. The king still can move to a2. So the rook now needs to control, because we are also threatening checkmate. So goes to a4. And of course, now we attack the rook and black is lost. If it protects the rook, we just checkmate it. And so black needs to offer the rook, and then it's an easy win with the king and rook versus king. Hope you have enjoyed. Lots of endgame theory going on this one. This is an improved version from the Saavedra position. And of course, I catch you up with future videos next time. Bye bye.